Introduction, my name is Richard Fennell and I'm responsible for training at Luxion. So what we'll do today is we're just going to go through some of the basics of render settings. Some of it's not going to be so basics, but kind of the intent here is to give you a thorough idea of what some of the sliders and controls mean. So we'll try to explain everything in a clear way and then talk about how it influences your KeyShot scenes. I'm going to be jumping through a couple of different scenes. Some things are going to be more helpful for kind of explaining certain concepts, but we'll go ahead and start off with this scene that I've got up here. So I'll be working with KeyShot 6.1. So that's the current release that we've got. I'll be using some pro features. I'll try to call those out whenever I use them. And then, yeah, if I use any hotkeys, I'll also call those out as well. So I'll go ahead and unpause my real-time rendering here. I had done that just using Shift-P. The scene's already set up. So in this webinar, we're not necessarily going to be focusing on things like materials or lighting. We're going to assume that you have a basic understanding of how to apply materials, work with some materials, work with different environments, maybe some experience with physical lights, although that's something we'll probably touch on when we get into rendering interiors. But if you have any questions, definitely throw them over to our questions area. So a little bit of breakdown on this scene. This was a model that was downloaded from GrabCAD. It's a pretty simple model. There are not a whole lot of materials to it. The outside of the kind of enclosure that was created using kind of a metallic paint to get a little bit more control over it, to give us kind of an anodized effect. This grill over in the front is been textured. It's a paint material, and it's got an opacity mask to it, or an opacity texture to it, which gives it that transparency as well as a bump and then a label thrown on there. So it's pretty simple from a model setup standpoint. Let's go over to the lighting, or excuse me, the environment tab. So for the lighting environment, right now we're just using one of the basic environments that's in the library. I always suggest changing your environment whenever you get going. Some of the library environments will have a little bit better contrast, some sharper highlights. They'll help your materials pop a little bit more. So in this case, you can see I don't have anything custom from an environment standpoint. It's really just out of the box. The materials are the only things that have been tweaked a little bit. We'll try to make this KSB available later as well. So what I want to do is kind of address some of the common questions that I run into in working with customers. So a lot of what we see are, kind of a product shot. Not all, but a lot of our customers are using the images on kind of a white background, simple ground shadows. Where we're going to be focusing today primarily is going to be over on our lighting tab. So this is what we're going to run through. So we're going to talk about all these different settings. Before we get to that, I want to talk about a couple of things that can affect your scene itself. Some questions I get pretty commonly are things like, how do I get better ground shadows, or how do I get more control over my ground shadows? So let's start there. In your environment tab, we have our real-time settings for, or excuse me, our settings for the rotation, the size, things like that. And then we've also got our background. So we have a couple different options for background. First is the lighting environment, which I just had on previously. If we want to put it in a white background, we can just hit color. We can also change that to some color. But under the ground drop-down, here's where we can actually control some things that are on it's essentially an invisible ground plane. Whenever we have our model and we reposition it and we snap it to the ground, then that puts it onto our invisible ground plane, which KeyShot basically has built in, and it's just there to primarily catch shadows. So you can see here under the ground we have ground shadows checked. If I enable and disable that, I can turn those shadows on and off. You can also change the color of the shadows. I almost never do that. Another thing we can do is we can enable ground reflections, and so this is all pretty common stuff. But what you'll probably notice here is that we have pretty limited control with what we can do over that built-in ground plane. Let's say, for example, if we wanted to make that less reflective or more reflective or add a little bit of roughness, we can't do that with the default ground. So an important thing in regards to scene setup and getting more quality out of our ground shadows is to actually add a ground plane. And we can add a pre-made ground plane just by going up to the Edit menu, Add Geometry, and then we can select Ground Plane. So before I do that, I'm just going to turn off my ground shadows and ground reflections. So right now we have nothing happening with our invisible ground plane. It's not doing anything. So I'll go to Edit, Add Geometry, and add a ground plane. And you'll notice I now am getting more shadows. The reason for that is that a ground plane has been added here to my KeyShot scene. So we've added a piece of geometry, and that's what's now catching the shadows. So under my Environment tab here, these ground shadows and reflections, if you add a ground plane, if you add that piece of geometry, go ahead and turn these off because they're going to be redundant, and if anything, they're just going to make it a little bit more complicated. So when I want to get more control over my ground, I tend to turn everything off here, and then I just hide that, and then I'm going to focus on my ground plane. So as you can see, I get that orange highlight around that piece of geometry, but because it is a piece of geometry, we're now working with something that has a material applied to it. I can either double-click on that ground plane, or I can hit Edit Material, and when I do that, you'll see that I'm now in my Material Editing tab. And you'll notice that the material type is ground. So if you use any of these pieces of geometry from the Add Geometry option, or the top three, the ground plane, the ramp, or the round, they'll automatically have that ground material assigned to them. What's really cool about the ground material is that it works essentially like a blending material. So no other materials in KeyShot are going to behave like this. What I mean by that is you can see here that I'm getting these shadows on my background color. If I were to throw on a backplate, I'm just going to grab one of the random backplates, and this definitely isn't going to fit for our scenario, but if I put on a different backplate image, right, so I haven't changed my environment, that's just a still image, you'll notice that the shadows actually blend into the background. Why that's really important is that no other materials in KeyShot will do this. You can't get that same result with like a clear plastic or a glass or anything like that. So you can see even if I rotate my camera, KeyShot's trying to blend those onto the shadows, and then in the future our reflections onto the background. So just a small but really important note, if I go back to color, again, it blends on. So that's why this material is so different. And you'll see here that I have more control over my ground material. For example, I can control my shadow color just like I could before, but then I have some other things that I can modify. The first one that I want to talk about is this little box for specular. So specular is a really good term to know. Specular color, or the specularity, defines the reflectivity of a material. So you can see here that the specular color by default is set to black, which means it's not reflecting any light. We have to think in terms of light with rendering in KeyShot. So if I go in and I change that color, and I'll just change that to white, now you can see that I'm getting more reflections because that material is now reflecting light, and it's reflecting all the light that hits it. So now you can see that I get these sharp reflections. If I want to control how reflective it is, I can basically cut off the reflectivity using grayscale values. So now you can see here with a specular color of white, it's really popping and I'm seeing that reflection. If I want to back that off, whoop, maybe a little bit too far, but I can use that color to define the reflectivity. So that's what that, the scientific term is specularity, and it just controls the reflectivity for that material. I'll set that back to kind of a light gray, and so you can see those nice strong reflections. What this material also gives you is a slider for roughness. So roughness doesn't add any texture. We're not going to get any real, texture on the surface, but what it will do is it's going to randomize those reflections, and this is a really good example. When light hits this surface, you have to, basically what we're assuming with roughness 0 is that the light's bouncing off like a mirror, which it is. But you'll notice when I increase the roughness, I start to break up those reflections. So that's what's going to happen with roughness. It's going to give us more of a matte or more of a satin finish depending on how far we push this. I'll also just drop this onto a little bit darker environment, or excuse me, background color. There we go, so we can see those a little bit better. So again, roughness set to 0, right, super crisp, and then now if I increase that roughness, it starts breaking up those reflections. So you get a lot more control with the ground material this way, and you get the benefit of being able to change those properties and add textures as well. I know we want to get to rendering onto a white background, but a couple of things I want to mention here pretty quickly. For example, under our textures, we can control the reflectivity using a texture, or we can add a bump texture or an opacity texture. Let's talk about bump, because here I'll drop that roughness back down to 0. I can go over to my textures, and instead of loading an image texture, which I could definitely do, I can also just, let's say I want to add a bump texture. I want to change the way the light bounces off the surface. I'll go ahead and hit the drop down, and I'll use something like a noise fractal texture. Right? This is going to give us a really interesting texture on that material. And again, my roughness is at 0. Now by adding the texture to that ground material, I'm really changing the way the light bounces off of it using that texture. And then I can still throw in a little bit of roughness. And then now I have a little bit more interesting of a material that my object is reflecting off of. So yeah, changing the specularity, control the reflectivity, adding a little bit of roughness or controlling that roughness, and then adding a bump. Some things that I do pretty often whenever I'm working with one of my KeyShot scenes, trying to get a little bit more control over to the on the ground plane. Let me take a look. It looks like we've got some questions. Or Josh or Rex, is there anything that I should address? I'll try to regularly kind of take breaks for that.
Nope, so far so good.
Okay, cool. All right, awesome. So we added that bump texture and we tweaked a few things. Let's talk about some other common things that I hear or run into. So I'll set that specularity back to black, and so now we have kind of our default. I'll also put this on a white background, and you'll see that now we're kind of where we started before, but we have our object on a white ground, on a white background, and we've got some kind of basic shadows. Something that happens pretty often is that people are going to render an image and then they're going to drop it into, let's say, something like PowerPoint, or they need to put it on a white background and they want to be able to composite it easily. Well, the shadows that we see on our ground, if we rendered it, something kind of far away, then those shadows would feather out nicely. But let's say we were doing a closer up rendering here, and you'll notice that my shadows aren't going to resolve, but I'm getting some shadows that are going to the very edges here. And that's the kind of thing that people tend to Photoshop out. They'll get a big fat brush and then they'll soften those shadows. Well, this gets a little bit more complex, but I want to talk about it because we can use our ground material in order to isolate those shadows. So here, if I double click on the ground plane and I go over to textures, we can define the visibility of our ground plane using an opacity texture. What this kind of means, if you haven't used an opacity texture before, it's kind of like layer masking in Photoshop. We can use gray or white or grayscale value, black or white values to define the visibility of our material. Just as a quick example, if I go over to my opacity maps and I grab something like this circular mesh, which has black and white dots, if I throw that onto that ground plane, I can apply it as an opacity texture or an opacity map. And you'll notice anything that's black, which is the dots, they are now invisible. We're not seeing the shadow because it's black. Anything that's white is visible, so we're seeing that shadow. This is kind of a weird example, but it shows you that you can actually define where that material is visible or not. So to get really fancy, but it's a material that you can make once and then save it forever, so you've got it. We'll use one of the more advanced textures called Occlusion. So I'll click on opacity and then I can use this drop down and I'll change that to Occlusion. Right? So what Occlusion does is it gives you color based off of the proximity to other geometry. So if you were, if you could think of two objects side by side, Occlusion will give you color based on whether or not there's something next to it. So this is a little bit tough to kind of comprehend what's happening here, but now you can see I'm getting kind of a white kind of ghosted area under my object. Well, the reason for that is right now we're using Occlusion to define what's visible and what's invisible. So anything that's occluded, that means anything that's next to my ground plane. You can see here next to my ground plane I have geometry. It's showing up as black, which for an opacity texture means it's invisible. All I'm going to do is invert these values, and then you should see the result pretty easily. So here, when they're both visible, we see ground shadows, but now unoccluded, I'll set to black. And now you can see that what we're essentially doing here is we're basically using this texture to mask out where our shadows are visible. So at this point, we're not, this isn't a realistic representation of our shadows, because our shadows would be extending a little bit farther. But what we can do is we can use these textures to actually mask that out. This radius, I didn't model this object. Oh, okay, so it's centimeters. But this radius here, that's unit aware. So if I type in something like 3, that's a 3 centimeter radius from where my geometry is. That shows us kind of the limit. So anything farther away than 3 centimeters from my object means it's invisible, right? But that's a really great way of masking out the shadows, because now if I render this out, a pretty similar angle to what we were before, you'll notice my shadows stop here and they stop here, and that makes compositing much, much easier. You know, we don't have to go in and Photoshop that. But yeah, so that's a little bit different concept, but there we're using the ground material, we're using that occlusion texture, and we're setting the unoccluded as black, which is invisible, or the occluded as white, which is visible, so we're getting just the shadows under that material there. Any questions so far on this?
Nope, nothing yet. I think
okay,
people
awesome.
like that little trick.
Yeah, I saw a really quick.
Yeah, asking about the fall off value.
Yes, so the fall off value controls how, when you see fall off anywhere in KeyShot, and you'll see that with some of the procedural textures, you'll see that with pins in the HDRI editor, that controls how sharp or how soft that edge is. If I increase the fall off value, it's going to give me a softer or more feathered edge, and here you can see that that edge is getting a little bit softer. Right, so in this case, I'll keep it at the default because I want a little bit of that shadow, but generally the fall off slider makes edges on things softer. But yeah, we can also bias this, so there are more options under here where we can try to increase kind of the density of the shadow. But yeah, I use this a good bit just for masking out that ground. But yeah, unless there are any other questions on the ground plane, I'll move on to render settings, and we can start hammering away at those. Okay, cool. So let's talk about our lighting tab, because this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time. We've done a lot of webinars on everything from materials to working with lighting techniques and things like that. So let's talk about some of the things that people have questions about when it comes to actually rendering your scene. One thing that we added with KeyShot 6 Pro that you have access to with Pro is the ability to do a real-time region render. So it's a really small thing, but definitely worth noticing. If you go to the Image tab and I check this little checkbox for region, what this will do is this will basically, without having to move my camera, I can focus all of the rendering power in KeyShot into some small area. So you can see here, this is going to render up a lot faster. It's a small thing, but if you're working with translucent materials or cloudy plastics or something that tends to be a little bit slower, or physical lights, right, then we can just use the region render to kind of limit all our rendering power into that one small part of the canvas. But that's something that I toggle on and off while I'm working. So just wanted to call it out quickly. That's a pro feature, but a lot of you can take advantage of that. So let's talk about lighting. In 6, we added what we are calling lighting presets, right? So these are preset lighting modes, and these are a great start, but it's also going to be helpful to understand what's happening behind the scenes here. One that I use a lot, performance mode. What this does is it turns down your ray bounces, and it disables a lot of our more advanced settings like depth of field or global illumination. You can always enable that just by hitting this icon up here in the ribbon, this little P with a circle around it. You can also toggle that on and off by hitting Alt-P. So what that's doing behind the hood, if I show these settings, it's going to be toggling on and off some of these checkboxes or limiting these sliders. Let's go through these because what people tend to do is they'll try basic or they'll try product, and a lot of times people just start cranking up sliders and then hoping for really good stuff once they hit the render button. My intent here is to make sure that what you see in the real-time view is representative of what you get in the rendering. Some people think if they just crank up all the sliders, it's going to look better in the final rendering. That's not necessarily the case. So let's start taking a look at some of these settings and what they actually mean. I'm going to be, like I mentioned, I'm going to be hopping back and forth between a couple of different scenes here. Most of these we can try to make available. They're going to be pretty basic, but some of them are going to be really good illustrations for some concepts. So first, let's talk about ray bounces, because that's one of the first sliders you have. So here in the scene, I'll hit F and go into full screen mode. Let's go over to our lighting tab, and you can see right now I'm just in my basic mode, and I'll zoom out and let's take a look at what's happening with this scene. This is a scene, it's been around for a while, but it's a good illustration of how ray bounces work. So what we have is a diamond, and it's in between these two mirrored planes. And if I click and drag and move my camera in, you can see that I've got the camera located between the mirrors, and our diamonds between the mirrors, so we see the reflection of those diamonds there. So in real life, light bounces around till it basically gets absorbed or bounces back into space, but in KeyShot, when we're rendering, we have to limit the number of times that light bounces. So here, right, this slider for ray bounces controls the number of times that light bounces around in the scene. If you only render things like metal or opaque plastics, this isn't going to be as big of an issue for you. If you work with clear plastics, glass, diamonds, any kind of clear things or highly reflective, highly refractive objects, this is going to have a big effect. If I grab this ray bounce slider and increase it, you'll see that I start to get more information. Right? With a low ray bounce value inside the diamond, it's a little bit dark, and also I just see this black, right? If I increase the ray bounces, I start to get more and more bounces in my scene. So increasing the ray bounces allows you to get more realism when you have things like transparent materials, refractive materials, things like that. If I really crank this up, right, so here, now because this is like a mathematically perfect, I'd have to crank this really, really far up in order to see that result. But what we're getting here is we're getting more accuracy. In this case, it's going to add on a little bit to our render time. So if we toggle back over to our other scene here, and I grab that ray bounces slider, you'll notice that if I set this to a low value, something like 6, which is the default, and I turn it up a bit, doesn't look any better, keep going, doesn't look any better. I could crank this all the way up, and I am not going to see much better results in my rendering because I don't have a bunch of transparent materials, right? So ray bounces are really easy to use because you can actually see the results in the real-time view. This is one of those things that if you set it too low, you can see here, right, with 0 ray bounces or 2 ray bounces, it looks okay, right? Much past 6, I'm not going to see any appreciable results. So if I'm working with fully opaque materials, I tend to keep that at a low value. Examples of that kind of rendered out. Let's say this example here. So here's what kind of the final image looked like. It's, what is that, 5 pieces of glass with a couple of labels on them. And so this is with the ray bounces turned up to 15. Let's crank that down. So these were already rendered. Here, these glass panels set to 1 ray bounce, and so you can see at 1 ray bounce took 5 seconds to just quickly kick this image out, and then 3 ray bounces lets us see more layers. That's 12 seconds, and if you can see up in the top left, it'll give you the file name, and it includes kind of the time it took. So as we're adding on ray bounces, we're adding on a little bit of render time, but we are also adding on realism, right? Because we're now getting more transparency in the glass because there are enough ray bounces to actually go through all those layers of the glass, right? And then we can keep on going there. So small thing, but important. That's how ray bounces are going to work. With our settings as well, one thing you'll always notice if you go from basic to product is global illumination is turned on. So global illumination is, I've got some examples here for that. So for example, global illumination. What is global illumination? So in this scene I have a cube, it's got a light in it. It's got two boxes and a green wall and a red wall. If I go from basic to product, you'll notice that global illumination turns on. So global illumination is light that bounces from one object to another or through one object to another. So here you can see with it turned off, I don't get a really realistic representation of what's happening with the light. With global illumination turned on, now I can actually see that the green light that bounces off is green, and I can also see it red. So this exists in real life. It's not something that you can turn off. Where it's also going to be really relevant for you, I've got a really quick scene here. I've got a case and I've got some little parts in it, so nothing too fancy from a setup, a scene setup. But if I go to my plastics folder and I get a hard, let's say shiny clear plastic, whoop, wrong folder, and I drag that over. You may have noticed this before, but I have a clear plastic, so that's a transparent plastic and it's got the right values in order to make it fully transparent. But if you're ever working with clear plastics, make sure your ray bounces up are a little higher. We're cranking them, and that's still, it should be good enough. Global illumination, if I turn that on, whoop, let's go to product here and toggle that on and off. Global illumination is what allows light to travel through one material to another or bounce off of one material onto another. So in this case, since the light was needed to travel through that clear plastic, enabling and disabling that will actually give you the result. So now we can see that. So if you're working with clear plastics, this is something that I run into pretty often. A couple other sliders that are in here that can get kind of confusing. Indirect bounces. If we enable global illumination, we have a slider for indirect bounces. You'll notice with that really turned down to 0, I don't get anything. You need at least one indirect bounce for global illumination to function. If I start increasing that, I might get better results. But indirect bounces it's how do I say this? I tested it out. I did a comparison for what kind of effect they have on your rendering. So here's what that same scene as before with global illumination turn on, and now you can see I'm increasing the indirect bounces. So this is indirect bounces to 2, here it is to 3, and we can keep on going. What you'll notice is that that tends to get a little bit grainy. So even with the bounces all the way up to 10, it gets a little grainy and it's hard to resolve. Instead of relying on indirect bounces, just use interior mode. Here's that same scene. Oh, by the way, all of these images were rendered just for 2 minutes. So 2 minutes, 1 bounce, 3 indirect bounces, 4, and we keep on going. All I needed to do to get a really neat, clear result is to just turn on interior mode if you're doing interior renderings. We'll come back to those, but this is with 1 indirect bounce and just checking the interior mode. So kind of a sneak peek. The interior rendering stuff, we have a much, much better way to do interior. So if that's what you dialed in for, we'll be coming back to that a little bit later. Takeaway here, keep your indirect bounces at 1 most of the time. If you're doing interiors, just use the interior mode itself. Okay, another checkbox down here that we'll see. With this scene, we just have the default. We have the default ground shadows, and we have under the lighting tab we have a checkbox for ground illumination. If I enable that, that enables illumination. Excuse me, just for our invisible ground plane. If I go back to my other scene over here, and where I had that ground plane, and I'll get rid of that that extra texture that we had on here. But if I then go over to my lighting tab and I enable ground illumination here, we don't actually see any result because, again, since we added something on the ground plane, a piece of geometry, that's going to override this setting. So I only enable ground illumination if I don't have an added ground plane. If I disable that and I go back and turn on my ground shadows, you'll see that with ground illumination turned off, I don't get any light on the ground. Now with it turned on, now I get a little bit of light on the ground. But again, I'll usually just use that added ground plane to get a little bit more control there. Okay, the other setting that's in there that, people will usually check and test out, caustics. So what are caustics? One of the best explanations for caustics are if you're, let's say you're outside by a pool on a sunny day and you're looking at the pool, and on the bottom of the pool the light that hits the water makes those interesting patterns. Or let's say you're drinking a wine glass or a water glass outside, and then the light hits it and you see those interesting patterns on the tablecloth. That's what caustics are. So caustics are when light travels through a transparent, refractive material, reflective material, different kinds of materials, and then makes interesting patterns with the lights. So this is actually a scene that anybody who's running KeyShot actually has. If you go to your KeyShot 6 resources folder, within that there's a folder for scenes. This one's called Caustics. So in this case, if I go over to my lighting tab, I am getting, you can see here, I'll turn off caustics. This is what the scene looks like without caustics. This scene, I'll just toggle my environment, hit E to make the environment visible. I've got a nice bright sun, I have a ground plane, and I have this glass that's set up to take advantage of the caustics. I can hit C for color to bring back my white background. Now if I enable caustics, you can see that I'm getting this really nice bright concentration of light. So in order to work with caustics, you're going to need three main things. First, you're going to need a bright light source, whether it's from the environment, like this one that has a bright sun. You're going to need an object in the scene that has transparent or refractive or reflective materials. In this case, that's this object here. And then additionally, for best results, add that ground plane. Right, so you can see here, if I disable the ground plane, I don't get really good results. Even if I turn on ground illumination, I'm not getting much. The third really important thing when working with caustics is to add that additional ground plane. That'll give you much, much better results. And that's with just the, as you can see here, that's just the default ground material. If I can then change it to some other material like diffuse or something like that if I want to get a little bit more control over it. But those three things, bright light source, clear refractive or reflective materials, and then our ground plane that we then add to it as well. Caustics are also used, so that's one really kind of simple example. Another one, if anybody's working with, let's say, lights, like this is a parabolic reflector, or if you do flashlights or any kind of lights. In this case, we have, it's a parabolic reflector that's been modeled, and then right in the focal point at the middle of that parabola, we added a physical light. So there's a tiny light in there. It's an area, excuse me, it's a point light. So it's just a really simple light that's reflecting light outward. So let's take a look at our settings here. Oh, the inside of this reflector is actually chrome. So even if I turn on product, right, I've got my shadows on, I've got good ray bounces, I've got global illumination, but I'm not seeing the light that gets cast. Watch what happens here if I turn on caustics. Now all of a sudden you can see that I have this really focused beam of light, because caustics are the extra calculations that make light bounce off of something like glass or in this case chrome, and give us those really interesting those beams that we can see projected onto the ground. If you do work with caustics, in this case, I just double-clicked on the inside of that parabola. You'll notice that this material has these kind of ribs on it, and those were just added as a bump map. Without a bump map, I kind of one cast of light, which is pretty, if I let it sit for a second, you can see I'm starting to get this interesting light pattern. Right? And caustics definitely take a little bit longer to render. These aren't going to be something you see in just 1 or 2 seconds. But now I'm starting to see this light pattern. I added a bump texture onto this one to put in a bunch of repeating lines, and you can see that that is going to have a pretty big effect onto the caustics that are created. If I change that to something like a wood texture, and I'll drop these noise values down, right? Any kind of bump texture that you add onto your materials that are supplying the caustics, like a ripple to your glass, or in this case, a wood texture, oh, let me scale it up, you'll start to see that that will affect the caustics, right? So now we're getting this really, really interesting light on the ground. And again, that's all coming from our bright light source, a reflective piece of geometry, and then a ground plane to actually catch those caustics. All right, let's take a sec. Any questions so far, guys?
Yeah, can you just show how you added is that a point light you have in there?
Cool. Yeah,
Talk
absolutely.
about that light, yeah.
Yeah. So that was just done. Oh, I will zoom in on my model here. So the way that lights are going to work in KeyShot is lights are a piece of geometry, or excuse me, lights are a material that we add to a piece of geometry. So what I did when I modeled this, and it's how I'd suggest you work with your lights, is I had a little sphere. And I'll edit that material, and let's just change that to a diffuse material, and let's change that to red so we can see it. You can just barely see it. But on the inside of this light, there's just a little sphere, right? So, and it can be any piece of geometry. So in order to make that into a light material, a couple different ways we can do it, but one of the easiest is go to your material library. We have a folder full of lights, and then we have a couple of different light types here. The emissive is going to be the most basic light type and the one that I use the least. The one that I used for this scene is a point light. So I just grabbed one of these, let's say a 6,000 lumen point light, and I can try to drag it onto the piece of geometry there. That might get a little bit tough. Looks like I got it. Okay. Yep. So now I've applied that light to that piece of geometry, and what you'll notice is I now get a tiny little yellow or orangish dot. That means if I go in and edit the material, that's the center point of the geometry. So now I have a single point of light, and it's casting light in all directions. Think like a tiny mathematical point, like just shooting light out in all directions like a sun. Super tiny little sun right there. Right. So now that's reflecting off of everything, and it's set to a power of 6,000 lumen. I recommend using lumen over watts every time. The way that watts are used in KeyShot isn't respected, or doesn't really reflect how we think of watts, like a 100-watt light bulb. However, if you use lumen and you buy a light bulb off the shelf, you can plug that lumen value in and get a really good representation of what it would look like in real life within KeyShot. But yeah, so to add a light, have a piece of geometry, apply a light material to it. If you don't have something already in place, then you can go up to edit, and just like we added that ground plane, you could add some simple piece of geometry like this sphere. So I added a second sphere. This was modeled in millimeters, so it's probably going to be really tiny. And then I'll move that out. Right, so now we can make that into a light just by grabbing a different material, dragging it on to that part. Having a tough time, there we go. You can always drag it directly over to the scene tree here as well. And so now I have a second light that was added. That color is way cooler than the one I had before. Right, but yeah, so now I have this really big pop of light because of that light that was added. And then I can maybe back down the brightness of it. But yeah, light is a material that you add to a piece of geometry, and then that's got to calculate all those extra caustics as well. But yeah, any other questions? We'll also get back to area lights when we talk a little bit about interiors.
Can you add an IS light real quick as well?
Sure, yeah, that's a great one. IES lights are really interesting. If I go to my folder for IES lights, you'll only see these previews if you upgrade to 6.1, which is a free upgrade to any KeyShot 6 users. But as I scroll through this list, you'll notice that with the, for example, point lights, it just looks like the point lights are like a little miniature sun. I don't see much detail there. IS lights are an industry standard light that you can actually apply within KeyShot. That means you could, let's say you work with a supplier who actually sells LEDs or provides LEDs, or you're trying to match some existing light. I could grab this IES profile, and then I can drag it onto my object. And now you'll notice that my little circle, my little placeholder geometry has now been replaced by this IES profile, this mathematical profile of what that should look like. IES lights are also directional. The area light and point lights in KeyShot don't include direction. But if I move this light around here in my scene, right, and I can get that to snap to 90 degrees by holding down Shift. If I move that, you can see that that this light is going to have direction, it's going to have temperature, color, and power all built in. And I'll go ahead and turn off my original light. Now I have an IES light inside of that cone, which is giving me a really, really cool effect here. And that's because this light actually has a lot of that information already built into it, but then it's also being reflected off the reflector on the inside, so that's why I'm getting that really interesting light. But yeah, IES lights will also give you direction information. They're way more powerful than just the basic point light or even an area light. Cool. Rex, any other questions? All right.
We have
yeah.
questions about color management and the output from KeyShot. So the output is always an sRGB, but we do have some color management options. Maybe just quickly touch on that.
Sure, yeah. If I go to the Edit menu and then go to My Preferences, if you work with a color-calibrated display or have a color calibration file, then under Color Management, you can load those color profiles. So yeah, if you do work with a color-controlled workflow, then you can just load those in, and then we'll ensure your color accuracy between all your different applications. But yeah, that's where you would plug those in. Cool. All right, so I'm going to try to make sure we get done here on time. So I want to just mention a couple other things. First, I want to talk about material samples, and then we'll make sure to get into interiors, because material samples are a very small, really important thing when you're working in KeyShot. Under render settings, right, and this is jumping ahead, but if you use advanced control, there's a sample slider which has got a value that's in there by default and all these other options. Whenever you're working with KeyShot, and let's say you rendered out an object and the materials didn't look so great, let's change this to a little bit more basic material, something in this case just like a paint, and I'll apply it here. If I were to render this out, I'm going to get some result for the material. If people aren't happy with their materials, what tends to happen is people will grab this slider here and they'll crank it up. And same thing as before, they'll sit and wait, and this rendering is going to take a lot longer because we've upped the samples, and they may or may not get a result that's better than what they had in the real-time view. What I mean by this is, let's hide this ground plane here. If you're working with a material, and let's say we've added some sort of bump texture to it. So let's say we add a noise texture to it, and I drop down my roughness values so that we can see this kind of bump texture. And let's add a little bit back in roughness. If you're ever getting kind of grainy results on your materials, and this happens sometimes, you let it render, but it's still looking a little bit grainy. Most, not all, but most materials are actually going to have a sample value hidden in that material sample. The reason is they're kind of hidden is because if you push these too far, then it's going to slow down your rendering. But what you can do is this global control, let's say we set that to a value of 10, we could keep our global samples at a lower value. And then when we're working with our materials, we can increase the samples for that material. So if I set this to a really low sample value, that means that this material will only get sampled once. So light bounces out and gives us kind of a result, and it only did it once. The more samples you get, the better the result will be on your material. But what's kind of overlooked is that most materials have samples in the materials, they're just kind of hidden. What this translates to, and I rendered out a couple of quick examples here, if I could find them, material samples, here we go. Here are some metals that have been rendered out. And these are all rendered as part of the same scene, and it's the same material. It's a blue metal with a roughness value of 0.1 on all of them. But you'll notice that all the materials have been rendered out with a different material sample. If I take a look at this first one, this has been set at a lower value. This is like an extremely low value. But that metal set at 2 samples, I'm seeing some kind of grain in the material. At 4 samples, it'll look a little bit better. 9 samples, this is the default, and the default looks okay. I'm getting a little bit of graininess in here, maybe in here, but then if I look at the one that's next to it, this was rendered at 16 samples, it's going to look better. And if I go all the way over and I look at the 32 sample image, you'll notice same rendering, same exact material settings, 0.1 roughness on all of them. The only difference is that the material samples are different. It's a really small distinction, but it's an important one. For any materials that take longer to render or you want to guarantee that they look a little better, what you can do in KeyShot is go in and you can increase the samples just for that material. Let's say I scaled this back down so I get a really small bump texture on that surface. Now, with the sample value at 9, that's kind of my default. And for quick renderings, 9 is usually going to be good enough. But let's say that material needs to look a little bit better. I want that to resolve a little bit more. I can type in a value of something like 16, and 16 is a value I use a lot on my materials. Now that material is going to get sampled a couple more times and it's going to give me a better result. You don't need to go to 24 or 32 on every material, but in this case I do want better results. You can see in this example here, it's a really similar example, metal instead of paint, but going from 9 to 16 improves the quality of that material without having to affect the whole render time. Because instead what people do is they go into advanced control and they crank up this value here. That affects all the pixels you see on screen, not just the materials. And this material setting here for the roughness value will actually override your global settings. So set the global settings low, settings high if you need it for some particular material, if that material needs a little bit more time to render, but we could do it that way and get better results. Any questions on that? I know it's kind of hidden in there, but it's an important distinction to make.
Nope, no questions.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so material samples, really important stuff. Good to know that that's in there, but I generally tend to do that to improve the material quality. Oh, where'd my mouse go? All right, there we go. Last couple of scenes I want to get into involve interior rendering, because that tends to be something that we're starting to see more and more of. And so let's talk about a quick breakdown on how to work with your interior scenes. I have a really simple example here, and then we'll hop into a more complex one. Also, anybody who's following along and noticed that I now have like 10 different KeyShot files open, if you're ever working like this, make sure you pause the ones that you're not working in. You can always do that by hitting Shift-P. But that ensures that this KeyShot scene is not being rendered, because otherwise this would be nuts trying to render this or have 10 files open. They'd all be rendering. Okay, so let's talk about this scene. What I have here, I will for now throw it into performance mode, but we essentially have a cube. This is a very simple scene like I mentioned, and I have a piece of geometry out of the window, which is our out of window view, and I have some glass, and we'll come back to the out of the window view. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to render the inside of this room. It's like the most minimalist bathroom you've ever seen. No faucet, no taps, nothing. All right, this is just for a kind of quick example. In KeyShot 5 and prior, we'd try to render this and we'd enable a global illumination and turn that on. What we added in KeyShot 6 is this button for interior mode. You can either click it here or you can go with one of the presets and enable interior mode. What this does is it's actually a different lighting algorithm, and it calculates light in a different way. It's also, so this little toggle right here, it's a small one, but this is really going to affect your real-time results. You can see with it turned off, I get some illumination on the inside. It's really grainy. Even with higher indirect bounces, it's probably going to stay grainy. All I need to do is enable interior mode, and this is going to be a different algorithm to give me some really good results. That said, if you are rendering any interiors, what you should try to get away from is doing what's happening in this scene and doing things like removing a wall or removing a ceiling. For the interior rendering mode, it takes advantage of fully enclosed shapes. So you really do want to have geometry that's basically catching the light inside and bouncing it around. So in this case, we have a couple of lights that are supplying that. So I'll use my little filter. All right, so hidden right outside my window. And the reason that there's a hidden light, and I'll hit Edit Material and I'll make it visible, is that for this particular request, so I got an emailed request for how to work with this type of image, but they wanted really, really bright light basically blasting in through the window like you see in a lot of architectural images and architectural photography. I could probably get something close if I used an environment. Actually, no. I could get light coming in through the environment, but if I rotated my environment enough for that light to blast in, then it would blow everything out. And so if I rotate this environment around, it's gonna. Oh, I'm hearing a little bit of weird feedback. I don't know if somebody's unmuted. Nope.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, cool, no problem. All right, so yeah, I can get a bunch of light here, but that'll probably end up blowing out my whole scene because it's like, you know, setting up a giant flashlight pointed directly in. So something I can also do is I added that piece of geometry. And so we haven't talked about the area lights, but we're going to apply an area light to this piece of geometry. So under our lights and then our area lights, I'll grab one of these and again go with lumens, not watts. I'll grab this light and I'll drag it over and apply it to that piece of geometry. So now I have basically a big fill light. They use these a lot in photography. I just have one single plane and it's sitting outside my window. A couple of key things here. Whenever you're working with physical lights in your scene like this, try to use planes or as simple geometry as possible. Those of you who have been importing cubes and then applying a cube and then using it to light your scene, that'll generally be a little bit more complex from a lighting calculation standpoint. A cube has got 6 sides and both sides are shooting light out, so you've got a lot more complexity. Try to work with the simplest geometry you can for the light. So in this case, that was really just a single plane that was modeled in. Whenever we're working with these lights, okay, so we'll keep the color the same and we'll bump up the brightness. Now we're getting some nice strong light in the room. In typical KeyShot fashion, if we want to type in a bigger value than the slider allows, just try it. It's going to work. Okay, so now we can hit our drop down under advanced and then we can start messing with some of these sliders. What are all of these? So every surface has a front and a back. We can enable and disable. Whoop, looks like the front was pointed towards the inside of our room. So if I disable back of geometry and I zoom out, you'll notice that the back of that plane is now black. It's not casting any light. So instead of having to calculate light going into the room and outside the room, we've just doubled the efficiency of this light, right, by just turning off the back. So we're getting less calculation happening. So trying to make it more efficient. We can also make it invisible to camera just by unchecking that checkbox. We won't see it. Right now it's not actually being, it's not visible to camera. We can uncheck visible in reflections because I don't want the reflection of the light. I just want that kind of soft light. And then also really important whenever you're working with these physical lights is I can uncheck visible in shadows. Currently it's being calculated with our shadows. If I turn this off, right now it's not being calculated with the shadows. So I can rotate this, my scene a little bit more. You'll see that I'm getting some light from the environment, right, as well as, I'm not getting a lot. Let me rotate it the other direction. There we go. So now we're getting that sharp light coming in through the window. If our material had visible in shadows checked, we wouldn't get that. So if you're using this technique, then definitely uncheck visible in shadows to get that light shining through. The last kind of trick that was used for lighting was adding in our view that was outside the window. So out of the window view. This was just a simple plane that was added. So there's a little bit of a gap between our actual window in that light plane here, and then there was another plane that was added, and this is going to be the view that we actually see outside the window. Sorry, and I'll quit moving the mouse so crazily, right? So let's double click on that material, and let's take a look at what those settings are for that material. Let's get on the inside so we can see this a little easier, right? So now there's our view. This is an emissive material, and the reason we're using emissive is because it allows you to texture it. So just like you could apply a leather texture or a wood texture to a material, we applied this image as a color texture onto that piece of geometry, because then we can make sure that our view is nice and sharp. If you tend to rely on environments, they're probably going to give you kind of blurry result. Having kind of a placeholder geometry outside and slapping an image on it is one of the best ways to control your view out the window. So what's important here, we kept the intensity at 1. Nothing's really changed in this, but what I've made sure is enabling visible to camera, right, so we can actually see that piece of geometry. Visible in reflections, this one really doesn't matter too much. I'll probably just turn actually, this is a great example. That's why I have that mirror there. If I have visible in reflections, you can see the reflection in the mirror. There's a mirror right here. If I turn that off, interesting. Now we can actually see the environment out the window. Right, so if you have mirrors or reflective materials and you want to be able to see that view in it, in this case we want to keep visible in reflections turned on. We also turn off that visible in shadows because then the light's going to pass right through it. But yeah, so that's how I tend to set up my scenes if I want to have a view outside the window. Using this, hit performance mode instead of pause. Using this technique, I rendered out, here's kind of a quick rendering, so that's what the final rendering looked like with that scene. Again, it's a really stripped down scene, but it's pretty indicative of what you can get by setting that up. If I would have added more lights, like ceiling lights or any other lights in there, I'd use the same technique with area lights and point lights. Just yesterday, I got a scene from Turbo Squid. This was the final result, so here's what that rendering actually looks like. It's a helicopter interior, and that was rendered in KeyShot. But if I go back and actually open that KeyShot file, you'll see that the setup is pretty simple. It's got a lot of materials, it's got a lot of parts, so it's definitely a much more complex scene. And here's our view inside, and under lighting, ray bounces we've increased to 20. So if you're using, so take a look at this. This is what it looks like without interior mode turned on. I saved it without it turned on. You can see it's kind of grainy. It'll stay grainy. All I need to do here is turn on that interior mode, and then it's going to flicker for a second, and I'm going to start getting faster, smoother results. So use interior mode for interiors, not for products, but it's going to give you some really nice results. And the way this scene was set up is I have a nice backplate image, right? So that's basically what you see in the background is a backplate, just a nice high-res shot of sky. But our lighting environment is one of the standard environments, right? The 2 panels, and then I just added image pins in order to get some more kind of cool light. And then I also added a tiny sharp pin to that environment to get to replicate the sun. You can see that nice sharp shadow here, and that's because I have a tiny little pin set to a radius of 2, super bright, no fall off, and exponential fall off, so that it's brightest at an infinitesimally small center point. But yeah, so that's what the environment looks like, but most of the light is coming from my light planes. So let's make those visible. So now you can see here 2 planes, right, outside the 2 windows, and they're oriented so the light's just going straight in. None of that calculation is getting wasted by having the light shine out. Right, and now if I move my camera back in, right, now the light's coming from our lit planes plus a little bit from the environment as well. But yeah, so we're hitting right 2 o'clock, so that's the hour that we had scheduled. If anybody needs to peel off, I totally understand that. Rex, there are probably some questions, or there may be some questions that have popped up. Do we want to try to address those and just kind of go over with any questions that we've got?
Yeah, I've gone through and answered most of the questions, but let's give a couple minutes just to see if some more trickle in. Let's see what we got here.
Okay. Cool. So if you've got questions, throw them over. A couple of things I just want to mention really briefly while we're waiting for those questions. We talked about our real-time view. What I tend to do is I tend to let this sit and kind of res up, and then when it looks good enough, I'll hit the screenshot button. If you need higher resolution images, I can always go to the render dialog. And here I can define an image type, everything except JPEGs will support transparency. We did also add PSD or Photoshop files, so you can do those as well. Anything that as the PNG file type, or excuse me, anything that has transparency, you just need to check that checkbox and then transparency will be included. Really important thing is under these quality settings. If you like what you see in your real-time view, what you can always do is just use something like max time to render out your images. Advanced control is on by default, or at least it was for a long time. That's where it works in from the squares and then moves outwards. If you use max time, this will give you a closer representation to what you see in your real-time view. So I tend to use max time more than advanced control because if I'm happy with what I see in my real-time view here, then I can just set it to render for a longer time and then hit the render button. Nice thing about that is if I do hit render, I can always save it and stop it where it's at. It renders the whole image at once and just refines it. So yeah, quick plug for max time render setting.
Okay, we have a question regarding interior mode and if you would use interior mode for any other cases rather than just a fully enclosed interior.
I don't tend to find, from what I understand, it can also be used for things like scenes that involve jewelry or caustics. I don't tend to use it for anything other than interiors because it will give you more accurate results for, I think, jewelry and caustics specifically. But again, it's really optimized for a scene where light is bouncing around on the inside of a clip. You're not going to see that for most product kind of rendering. Where you'll run into kind of an interesting position if you're, let's say, rendering the inside of a refrigerator. Then the interior is going to look great with interior mode, but you'll have to kind of, if the doors are open, then the outside of the doors aren't being helped by interior mode. So that's like one of the toughest scenarios that I can see you having to make that choice. But otherwise, yeah, I stick with interior mode just for the interiors.
Cool. Can you talk about rendering with an alpha channel when using transparent materials? So the basic glass material actually provides the alpha channel along with the transparency, whereas something like a clear plastic would not?
Right, yeah, and that makes, that's a pretty common question that we get. You're right, they don't include the alpha channel. The reason for that is if we're actually rendering one of the more advanced transparent materials like dielectric, solid glass, liquid, then they take refraction into account. So let me hop in performance mode really quick in this scene and I'll show you what I'm talking about. If I just add something like a sphere and here, so I've got a little sphere in the scene. It looks like it's teeny tiny, so I'll scale that up a little bit more. Right, and now I double click on this material and I set it to something like solid glass. And let's get it out of performance mode. And if I look at that sphere, the image that I'm seeing through it is distorted, right? It's just like we had a crystal ball sitting on the inside of this helicopter cabin floating in space. But what you'll notice is the distortion in the image. The reason that we don't include alpha channels with any of the advanced materials is that this distortion is correct, like it's physically accurate. So if you're just trying to get a piece of glass and make it transparent, we don't have a good way of doing that because the way we calculate transparency actually includes the way the light, for example, comes in through this window and then is refracted through that piece of geometry. There are ways to kind of get around it, but they generally involve some amount of post-processing or working with the material graph. I know it is a pretty common request that we do get, but since that's a refractive material, we can't just, it's not as simple as just making that transparency in the output image.
For more helpful tips, subscribe to our channel at youtube.com/KeyShot3D. Go to KeyShot.com/learning for more videos, tutorials, and quick tips.